The NFL reminds me of Goldman Sachs. You know, Greg and I had the majority of our career at Goldman Sachs, and Goldman Sachs.
Weren't you in the same analyst class?
Yes, we were. We started together, and you know, Goldman would always watch everybody trailblaze. They'd see what worked and what didn't work, and then when they found what worked, they would come in full force and blow everybody else out. That's what the NFL's doing here.
Yeah.
The NFL's watched, to their credit, they've watched this capitalism going to work. You know, it's the new money that's come into sports that deems it an asset class. You know, I've been investing in sports for 25 years, and I'm not so sure, you know, when the equity research for sports is Forbes magazine, you know.
You mean Bloomberg.
Or Bloomberg, right. You know, when Goldman Sachs or any of the firms start writing really credible, detailed research on sports, let's sit down and talk about that. But it is indicative of the fact that, you know, we have an imbalance here, and it's overshot. But you know, the great thing about capitalism is it self-corrects. So
Yeah.
the NFL has watched, and what's great about the NFL is they're going to most likely embrace the introduction of institutional capital into their ecosystem, but on their terms and in their way. And I think that's a huge positive because, you know, it's a little bit of the Wild West right now. And it's interesting, you know, from an NFL owner's perspective, you know, a question one could ask is, how is an NBA team worth more than an NFL team, right? And the answer is, well, for the most part, there's difference, you know, at different bookends of the spectrum. Maybe that's the case, but in general, that's not the case. But it is by virtue of the artificial inflation of valuations that you've seen go on by the capital formation around buying minority stakes in teams with no governance and no pathway to liquidity. And so I think it's a positive because the NFL's doing it the way they're doing it in a way that's adaptive to their ecosystem. And again, you know, if you're Roger Goodell, step back, what's your goal? So the last high watermark was $6 billion on a trade. We did have the price talk around the Dolphins at 7. You know, his goal is to get this linearly with as little volatility as possible to 10 billion a team.
Right.
Will that happen? Yes, that will happen.
How soon?
Won't be all of them.
How soon at 10 billion?
Well, if you ask Jerry Jones, he'd tell you right now.
Right.
Right? But Jerry Jones is.
Jerry Jones would tell you a lot of things right now.
Well, but Jerry Jones isn't transacting on a control basis.
Yes.
But look, I mean, the price talk around the Dolphins, if it's true, is interesting. Here's the punchline. The punchline is it's artificially inflated. If you're the NFL, that's okay because, you know, they'll always be able to catch up. In a lot of these other instances, the question is going to be, particularly for investors, you know, what's the entry point for you? Because you've had this massive escalation in these valuations, and frankly, a lot of the times, people in the infrastructure hasn't kept pace.
Right.
And it's in that dislocation that, frankly, I look at that, and that's basically our investment model. You go into that gap and you close it by creating companies around these teams and leagues.
Right. I'd say the one piece that's interesting, especially on the NFL, is I agree with Jerry. The introduction of institutional capital will serve to drive valuations, although that's not the objective. If you actually talk to Roger Goodell, the person who's going to go sell their team for $10 billion, Roger doesn't care about it because he's leaving the league. That person's leaving the league. So what he cares about is the financial stability of the new owner that's coming in and the other 32 teams. That's why there's strict debt limits. It's why they're being really particular about what kind of capital comes in, the structure of the capital. What they really want is a very financially healthy league, and given the value of these franchises and the increasingly limited number of people that can write meaningful equity checks as individuals, bringing that institutional capital actually protects the sanctity of the health of the league.